Hey, good morning, Jordan.
Good morning, Anne. How are you?
I'm excited to film another episode of AM Radio with you today.
I'm excited too, but why are you so excited today? Who are we interviewing?
I am kind of fangirling out on our guest. His name is Zack Kass. He was one of the early founders of OpenAI, which built ChatGPT. And we had him speak at our recent Gold Forum conference for our advisors, and it was absolutely riveting. So I'm so excited to dive in a little deeper with him today.
We're going to be discussing his book, The Next Renaissance, AI and the Expansion of the Human Potential. In this book, he tries to talk about not just, how we use AI today, but the potential of AI and where AI can potentially lead us.
And I think beyond AI, he's really like a humanitarian social scientist, also really studying the direction we're headed in incorporating machines with our society and protecting community and community spaces. So I'm really eager to dig into that with him a little bit.
I am too, maybe for different reasons than you. I won't lie. I'm one of the skeptics who, or was one of the skeptics who thought, AI is going to ultimately just displace humans. And if they're doing all the work, what are we going to do? But after reading his book and hearing some of his earlier talks, I can say that he's kind of dispelled that common myth, that a lot of misconception, I should say, that a lot of people share.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's such a timely topic, and I'm so excited to dig in with Zack on his thoughts further.
Let's dig in. I'm Jordan Harrison.
And I'm Ann Hutchinson.
And this is AM Radio. Zack, thank you for coming on this morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with you. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Santa Barbara, California.
Hey, Zack, you helped build ChatGPT at OpenAI. When you were doing that, were you aware of what a seismic moment it was in human history?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and thanks to anyone who's listening. I should be clear. There are people who built ChatGPT, and I did not get to write code that contributed to it. But I sat in a lot of the rooms that we discussed the plans for it, and I would love to, take as much credit as that affords me. I don't think that anyone appreciated what we were building until a few weeks after. And part of the reason for that is that the product was initially built as a web app, and the idea behind it was that it would help people understand what GPT 3.5 API was capable of. So the whole point was to bring people back to the API and drive token consumption. And of course, in the process, we built the most popular consumer app ever. And I think it probably took some of us probably updated really quickly when we saw the virality, and others a little bit longer. But certainly within the first month, it was very clear that most people on Earth would know about this product pretty soon.
You make a claim in your book that this isn't just a technological shift, but it's like the next revolution. Paraphrasing, of course. Can you talk to us through your thinking about it being bigger than the printing press, bigger than some of the other technological advances that we've seen in our history?
Well, there's a really simple argument for why it's bigger than the printing press. The printing press doesn't proliferate in adoption early on, principally because the church controls what can be printed. And for a long time, the only thing printed was a Bible. And only after the technology found its way beyond the control of the church did we start printing other texts. And still then, only about 150 years after that did people start learning how to read, because most of the texts weren't worth reading. And so you have a world where the printing press invention in the 15th century leads to literacy in the 19th century, and not really global literacy until the 20th century, which is a remarkable thing to consider, that most people just did not read until very, very recently. And that is a result of technology sort of being rate limited by the other technologies that it can piggyback on. The supercomputer, or the chips that we so appreciate today that sort of power this new digital world, principally work because of the internet and also because of airplanes, right? I mean, our network of global trade allows us to distribute stuff a lot faster. And without these two things, chips don't make a huge difference. So AI sort of gets to play on all of the prior technologies and diffuse what we call distribute to people much faster. But also this Moore's law, this law that says technology gets twice as fast and half as expensive every 4 years, well, that's actually now compounding too. So you're watching machines get much better and much cheaper, much faster than ever before. And that all leads to sort of these like exponential gains, and which is why sort of historical comparisons can fall down. The other point that I try to make in the book that I'll sort of make now is ChatGPT and most of the products that we are discussing today when we talk about AI, these are kind of silly on any probably likely historical basis. In the same way that if you had been sort of standing next to Edison when he invented the light bulb, and you know this thing would turn on, and you'd say, "Oh wow, so that's electricity." And Edison would say, "You would say, well, yes, that's sort of electricity. That's a light bulb, which electricity powers, but electricity is many other things." And ChatGPT has caused myopia in many ways. And a lot of the products in the market today, people stare at and say, this is AI. Well, sort of. AI is actually cognition as infrastructure, right? It is at its end state, probably invisible technology that powers the world, much like electricity and the internet. We just don't think about it that way yet because we're still thinking about AI as a product. And that's the principal argument I try to make in the book, to get people to zoom out a little and think about the implications of this when it sort of powers everything.
Yeah, you reference unmetered intelligence in the book. And is that kind of what you're describing that's underlying all these apps and things that people are using on the surface, but underneath we're kind of creating this unmetered intelligence?
That is right. And unmetered intelligence is a theory that I coined in 2021 when I was trying to explain to CEOs a future state where cognition would commoditize. And intelligence will not be free. Nothing is free. Electricity is not free, but you don't think, if I come over to your home and plug my phone into your wall, you don't sit there and check the meter and charge me for the amount of electricity I'm using. Water, similarly, is unmetered in most of the developed world. And actually foodstuffs, in many cases, is considered unmetered in a lot of the developed world. If you go to your local Mexican restaurant, they'll just keep bringing chips out to the table because we figured out how to make corn so inexpensive and fry it so inexpensively. So this is following a rich tradition of things that we've taken as very scarce and then turned them into abundant or commodities. And commodities often operate on some measure of unmetered. At the current rate, intelligence will feel the same. Now, I should call out, I don't argue that everyone will be brilliant. Unmetered intelligence is a theory that does not propose universal brilliance. It proposes access to universal brilliance. But in the same way that electricity, or rather in the same way that literacy doesn't mean that you read, in the same way the internet doesn't mean that you do any research, access to this technology doesn't mean you will harness it. And so how we harness it individually and collectively is sort of the arguments I make in the book. That will determine our collective outcomes.
You talk about the adoption gap between what AI can do and how we use it. And it's sort of what you're talking about with unmetered intelligence, it sounds like. Can you explain kind of the adoption gap in more detail?
Well, the argument in the adoption gap is sort of, again, on a collective and an individual basis, people do and don't adopt technologies. And there are places in the world that look so unfamiliar or so dissimilar to each other because principally a set of values, cultural norms, and also technology adoption. Right? You can go to a place like Tokyo or Singapore, and then you can go to a place, somewhere remote destination, a village, and it almost looks like two places on different planets, right? One almost in the future and the other decidedly in the past. And that is the adoption gap. It's not that technology doesn't exist. It's that one group or an individual has chosen to adopt it and the other has not.
In wealth management, what do you think specifically is driving the adoption gap? Is it kind of the fear of, drawing the line of what you allow AI to do versus what you want humans to do, or is it driven by something else?
Well, it's a good question, but I think we should sort of separate. There are two adoption gaps here. One is the wealth managers use of the technology, and the other is the client's use of the technology. And a lot of people have said, and this is sort of a common refrain, a lot of wealth managers will say, well, my client doesn't support my use of AI, or my client doesn't want me to use AI. And I always ask, well, in what capacity? I mean, I certainly don't want to pay my wealth manager to produce a AI generated, tax plan or wealth plan. That feels like something that smart people who I pay a lot of money to do should do.
Mm-hmm.
But I would certainly really appreciate if my wealth manager recorded our conversation so they could collect notes more easily, so that we didn't constantly have to double back on something that we previously discussed. And this is this goes to this broader issue, which is people in regulated markets will often sort of group everything together, and they'll say, well, we can't do AI because of policy or because of compliance. And I'll say, well, no, you can't produce you can't auto purchase equities with AI. That's definitely not supported by the FDIC or the SEC, but you can do lots of other stuff. And then
Yeah.
on the client side, oftentimes what we discover is that they are very keen for technology that can improve their service, and frankly aren't really aware of all the things that could exist. You also have a more traditional demographic, right? Most people who have wealth managers are at an age where they probably are either approaching retirement or past retirement, and don't spend all day sort of in the technology appreciating what it can do. And so you have these sort of like more conservative forces dragging the adoption gap maybe further behind other industries.
Zach, how should advisors, or how can they start to identify or differentiate themselves in a world where everyone has just as much access to intelligence as the next person?
What I think, what I've observed work quite well is to pick the principal complaints that most people have, not with their wealth manager, but with wealth management broadly. Things like, I said this thing a long time ago and I can't remember what I said, or we made this plan a long time ago and why aren't we sticking to it? Or in some cases, I know, someone told me about that, we've talked about this idea, and I just can't recall, or are we actually executing it? And then in others, hey, my wealth manager hasn't responded, or I have this question that I don't know if it's worth calling them about. I would really like to get help and support on. Stuff like that makes a huge difference. And as you sort of peel back the principal complaints that people have about wealth management broadly, you realize that there are some like very basic ways that we can use this technology to improve it. I stand on a soapbox when I talk about wealth management and broadly financial advisory and literacy, and remind people that it's very easy for us to talk about all of the wealthy people who have financial advisors. We forget often that most of the United States isn't considered financially literate to the standard that we would like to set, and doesn't have access to wealth advisory because a wealth manager doesn't consider their net worth to be profitable to manage. That population is the one I write about in the book. That's the population that I think that we should pay the most attention to as fast as possible, because we would greatly benefit as a society if we helped the people with the least amount of money stop struggling so much. And in fact, if we lifted the floor, it's very expensive to be poor, especially in the developed world where lots of people are comfortable sort of preying on your financial illiteracy, right? But payday loans, predatory lending, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
We can overnight, if we want, help these people. And a lot of this is about figuring out ways to sort of scale access to really smart people, not by automating all the things they do, but by automating some of the things they do.
Yeah, I was on a plane recently reading your book, and the gentleman next to me spent the entire flight coding using Claude Code and building stuff. He had like 4 screens open, which I thought was an interesting contrast. But one of the things that you talked about there that I really liked and responded to was the idea that we don't want our machines to act and sound like humans, how that can be a risk. So would you tell us a little bit more about that?
This I don't know if it's shared broadly in the AI industry and community, but this is a particular bone that I have to pick, which is I am terrified I sort of spell out some of the downside risks of this moment. And one of them I call out as dehumanization, which is when an individual discovers more interest in a virtual or digital reality than a physical one. And there are basically two forces right now that are driving the dehumanization that we observe. One of them is the addiction to the screen, which everyone is susceptible to, and has really permeated society, and is something that we can talk about openly now and say, God, we really do not want to use the screen this much. And that is sort of broadly an issue that we need to figure out how we can free ourselves from actively staring at a screen. The other is, what we call sort of like bluntly chat psychosis, or this obsession with a digital or virtual entity. And that is deeply concerning, in part because it preys on people who are most susceptible to needing and feeling fulfilled by virtual empathy. And that is particularly exacerbated when the entity is anthropomorphized, when we give a name or a face or a human body or figure to a virtual or digital entity. And I'm pretty adamant that we should actually, as best we can, pass laws or set cultural norms against this. I don't even want humanoid robots. I mean, there has to be a more optimal physical AI, but also I don't think we want virtual and digital machines to resemble humans. And I think we should draw a very clear line around this to avoid, especially the susceptibility of children and the elderly, those seeking a connection, to find it in these machines, because frankly, we know it won't work. We've seen this play out enough to know that these machines may provide some sort of short-term satisfaction, but in the long run, they actually drive greater depression, anxiety, loneliness, as depicted, by the way, in all of our dystopian films about the matter, films like Her or Blade Runner, where these protagonists eventually discover that their love interest is in fact not a human, and it breaks them. We have to avoid even flirting with that world.
You talk about the work your father has done as a physician, an oncologist, and how that relates to bedside manner kind of becoming the product. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and also how it applies to the wealth management industry?
Yeah, I'm quite proud. I'm very proud and always happy to tell this story. I'm also my dad. My dad retired actually last week. So it's
Oh,
yeah,
congrats.
it's super exciting. And but so I grew up in a hometown that sort of celebrated my father as a pillar in the community, and never really understood why until very recently. He's an oncologist, as you described, and he specialized in breast cancer. And during his practice, which would span almost 40 years, everyone would tell me how amazing my father was, and I growing up associated his success with his brilliance, because part of my identity was how smart he was. The former patient spoke about my father for 5 minutes. For the first 30 seconds, she talked about her patient outcome. She had survived breast cancer and was giving back to the community alongside my dad. And for the next 4.5 minutes, she talked about how he made her feel. And she described the process of getting a breast cancer diagnosis and going to see 3 oncologists in Santa Barbara County and getting the same 3 prognoses and the same 3 treatment recommendations. And then she said it occurred to her after the third identical prognosis and treatment recommendation that the doctor was no longer the smartest thing in the room, that the technology had progressed far enough that the machine was now prescribing the next best action. And therefore, she said, the bedside manner is no longer a feature, it's the product. And that truly changed my life. It is actually the impetus for why I wrote the book. It is the basis of an enormous amount of my conviction. Because in that moment, it occurred to me that my father was now important to the community, as he probably had been for some time, not because he was brilliant, but because he was courageous and compassionate. He admitted that he had passed his intellectual sell-by date. And he said, I also think that I have never been a better doctor. I can now care for the whole soul and spirit of every patient who comes through my doors. And the principal argument in the book is that we do not hate technology. We, in fact, love technology. We hate the screen and we hate the way in which it has divided us recently. We spend so much time worried that AI is going to make us less human. And part of that concern, I think, comes from a deep underlying sense that may require that we be more human, that we may actually have to confront what it means to be human if we can't just be smart, right? If we are no longer the smartest thing on earth, then we have to be the funniest or the most caring or the most thoughtful. We have to find a way to compete on a basis that we probably wanted to compete on all along that just wasn't economical. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Zack, I know we're getting on time here, and I know you have a hard stop. If you could give one piece of advice to our listeners, to financial advisors, what would it be?
I think that most people should, as best they can right now, think about not just providing better service, but expanding their ability to provide it. There are going to be a lot more people who want wealth advisory services in the next 10 years. And the successful advisors are not just going to be better at serving their clients, they're going to be better at serving more clients, and expanding your book of business on a sort of per head basis is going to be critical. I also think wealth managers need to very soon start talking about the issues that are going to plague people, including financial fraud and deepfake crime. And being a financial advisor that gets out in front of things like operation security training, helping your clients protect their money, not just make more of it, is going to be really important in separating great from just good wealth managers.
Amazing. That is incredible advice. And we are so grateful for your wisdom and your time with us today.
It's been an absolute privilege to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
Thank you both so much.
AssetMark Inc. is an investment management and consulting firm that helps independent financial advisors build great businesses. This is for informational purposes only, is not a solicitation, and should not be considered investment, legal, or tax advice. The information has been drawn from sources believed to be reliable, but its accuracy is not guaranteed and is subject to change. References to financial advisors and service providers are intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered an endorsement or recommendation of AssetMark. Each party is responsible for their own content and services. AssetMark and its affiliates may engage with providers for services. Investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. AssetMark Inc. is an investment advisor registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. This content is protected by copyright attributed to AssetMark Inc. 2025. All rights reserved.